Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us here today for this Embedding Lived Experience panel discussion. My name is Danielle McCaffrey, and I'm the Prevention of Gender-Based Violence Lead at Women's Health in the Southeast. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to all the panelists that have agreed to share their wisdom with us today, and I'm excited to hear from you all. I want to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where we work and live, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I come to you from the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I invite you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Australia was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today, we will aim to focus on how we can embed the experience of people with multiple intersecting forms of oppression and discrimination in the primary prevention workforce and sector. And I think this will be applicable to our work with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I will quickly outline the session today, but while I do, if you could all take a minute to fill in this pre-session survey, that would be amazing. And I'll also put the link in the chat. WISE needs to show our funders the impact of events such as these. So your feedback is invaluable. Thank you so much. Just put the link in the chat. So firstly, our CEO, Kit McMahon, will give you an overview of how we got here and what our aims are for today. We'll then hear from Nina Story, who will set the scene for us about what it meant to her to be a lived experience co-facilitator in WISE project last year. Then Kit will introduce us to each panelist who will tell us a bit about their work and how they're embedding lived experience. We'll then have a quick break, just to have a screen break, and we'll meet back for a full panel discussion, after which we'll be allocated into breakout rooms where you'll be asked to come up with some recommendations for how we can apply the learning from today in the primary prevention sector. So please put any questions in the chat, and if we have time, we'll address them in the panel discussion after the break. So with no further ado, I will stop sharing and I will hand over to the amazing Kit McMahon.
Thank you so much, Danny, and thanks to everyone. And I too want to begin by acknowledging the First Nations people, the traditional custodians of this land. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land. And I welcome the opportunity to learn and grow from the Uluru Statement of the Heart and look forward to voting yes in the Voice to Parliament when that time arrives. Thank you for being here today from whatever lands you are from. So in October 2022, WISE, along with the Integrated Family Violence Partnerships of Southern Melbourne, of Bayside Peninsula, together with Chisholm TAFE, we held a conference to understand what centering lived experience meant for our region and our partners and our community. The conference itself was a great, strong opportunity for the workers and the peoples of our region to understand this work more, to build on the evidence, to learn from the expertise and the legacy. But for today, at this moment and that conference, what emerged was a need for a framework, a way of working and guidance about how that lived experience need to be centred in primary prevention work. WISE and our partnership has taken this recommendation, this output of board from that conference, that output that said that we need to do this. And actually, you're here today to start this process. So what we learned was that there's huge legacy thinking, there's huge leadership, study, advocacy for centering lived experience. There is more work to be done, and certainly an emerging view that in family violence, what it means for primary prevention activity may be different for what it means to what we call the response sector in family violence. It's not that the two worlds are so different, but in primary prevention, we work to stop the violence before it starts. And in doing that, we work to address the drivers, to stop inequality, to address intersectional barriers, to build relationships, connections, to enable capacity and capability to advocate. It's long-term work, and I think it's recognised that in the broad sweeping work and world that is the family violence sector, it is distinct. So this is the starting point. We think that a framework for primary prevention of family violence to centre lived experience actually needs to centre the lived experience that we work with. Perhaps we centre intersecting forms of oppression, inequality and discrimination, and that includes the experience of family violence. Well, this is what we're going to find out today. So in saying this, we are not proposing to reinvent the wheel, but rather build on that legacy and perhaps reframe the practice for primary prevention work. And from my experience, I don't think we would be doing primary prevention the service it needs if we did not reframe lived experience work this way. So, to get things going, to start our minds ticking, reflecting, and considering the possibilities of how we create this framework for primary prevention of gendered violence, violence against women, men's violence against women, and family violence, we're going to hear from lived experience of those that do this as part of their work. Then, as Danny says, we're going to try to create this environment for ourselves where we can consider with our colleagues what this all means for us. So it's my great pleasure to move to the next stage of our event by handing over and introducing you all to the incredible Nina Storey. Now, WISE was privileged and proud to work with Nina last year in a project that we called WISE Women, a project that saw our team in strong partnership and centering of lived experience support a group of women in corrections. Nina Storey is an unapologetic criminalised survivor who has experienced state-sanctioned violence and now spends her time advocating for the rights of criminalised survivors. This advocacy commenced in 2018 as a member of the Women's Transforming Justice Project. And Nina now sits on the Victorian Victim Survivors Advisory Council, is a member of the expert advisory panel at Safe and Equal, is a weaver at Melbourne University, and sits on the steering committee of the Homes Not Prisons campaign. Nina, thank you so much for being with us today. And I might open this moment by asking you a question, if I may. Nina, about the WISE Women project specifically, what was it about the project, the elements, the structures of that project that made you feel safe and supported to participate? And is there anything we can learn from it? Thanks, Nina.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the introduction. I would too like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Boonwurrung people. I work, live and play in a place called Malau, which others might know as Phillip Island. And yeah, I just feel deeply honoured to have been asked today to make the opening remarks. And I think it speaks to the dedication of involving lived experience throughout my engagement in this project. I think it's important to mention first and foremost that although it's not a requirement to have pre-existing relationships with people when you ask for their lived experience or expertise to be a part of something, I did have a pre-existing relationship with Lula, which was one of the co-facilitators. And this had a hugely profound impact on the way that I navigated space and safety and comfortability from the very onset of this project. And this allowed me to engage with ease and gave me a sense of feeling that I had nothing to prove to anyone because I was already accepted for my experience and my expertise. Which hasn't always been my experience when I advocate as lived experience, especially when there's that dynamic of lived experience versus professional.
Okay. So that exists. Sorry, you go, Nina.
I was just going to say, and I think too that throughout my involvement in the project, I was very carefully selected to undertake the work given the nature of my lived experience and the cohort of the criminalised survivors that were the participants of the program. So immediately I felt like I had provided like a really direct relationship to the experience of the women that were participating in the program.
So you've used this word relationship a couple of times now. You talked about the relationship that you had with the project team and the relationship that you brought to the women in the program. If we think of our work in primary prevention, I guess, how do you see, or what are the important things that organisations need to think of to make the right conditions to set up those relationships? What are those safety things? What do you think of yourself that you need to make sure you're setting up positive relationships?
I think for me, it was like the way that I established the relationships was by building trust and rapport and being able to relate to the participants and having similar experiences. So, and I think that that's what I was speaking to with the last point of being really carefully considered. So like, you know, my experience had a direct relationship with the experiences of the participants, which immediately gave me a sense of belonging and a sense of understanding.
Yeah.
And throughout the project, the participants were given opportunities to provide feedback after every session, and they spoke of that relationship as well.
Yeah. I'm really interested in this idea that you talk about similar experiences. I think one of the things that I often hear about, Nina, is this idea of whose privilege are we centering in this work, you know, and that deliberate act. Maybe that's one of the things, that the first thing that we're taking away from you is that centering the lived experience is looking, well, what is the rapport moments? What is the similar experiences? What are the experiences, lived experiences of the people we're working with that we need to recognise as well?
Yeah, and how do you relate to the people that you're trying to serve?
Yeah. Nina, before we go on to the next speaker, if I can, just one more question. One of the things that we know from the work that the Weavers do, that Safe and Equal does as well, is this idea of making sure that the lived experience person is ready for the work, right? It's in the work that you do. I know we've learned from you and others about, we've got to be careful what you know, the work is triggering in itself. It is a triggering environment. Can I ask you, Nina, I guess, what things do you do, or what have you learned over your time of doing this work about what you need to do to prepare yourself for the work that you do as a lived experience advocate and professional?
Oh, look, that's a really tricky one, because I think that some days, you know, having, you know, been part of having a human condition of suffering, and like, you know, I think everyone's navigating new spaces from time to time. So I don't think that like sometimes you can be entirely always ready. You never know when a trigger is going to come up. But I think what had a really profound impact on me with working throughout this project was that there was a real connection point. So prior to every session, we would go out for coffee and share food and build that rapport within the facilitators and be able to nut out relationships. And it wasn't always directed to the planning that we would undertake throughout the day of the session, but also just to navigate spaces and share vulnerably of what was going on in our personal lives. So I think like it really had that human element and that human approach to be able to talk to your colleagues and co-facilitators in a really human, natural approach, and to be able to support each other throughout the project, but also on a personal level, which I think had a really strong impact. And I think too, it's important to note that within the project too, there was a counsellor present, and so there was very much a therapeutic approach, and the participants were also offered to engage with her services out of the session times.
Yep.
So there was a lot of safety and consideration that was thought about throughout the project, and all of those sort of like relationships that I was speaking about earlier, you know, the relationships between co-facilitators and also between participants, and then between other professional therapeutic sort of components.
So again, this idea of the relationship and having the rapport across the team to know what's happening. Thank you so much, Nina. I could talk to you forever, but I might, if I may, move on to our next speaker, who for some folk will be well known. So everyone, I'm going to introduce you all to Lula Dembele. Now, some of you will know that Lula used to work for WISE, but Lula is now the Director of Lived Experience and Advocacy at Illawarra Women's Health Centre, where she continues to create world peace. What do I know about Lula? She's an advocate fighting to change patriarchal systems, improve gender relations, and a passionate survivor advocate for victims of childhood sexual abuse, childhood and adult domestic violence. Lula, you were part of the team that created Healthy and Wise Women. And we've just heard what Nina says, talking about, you know, the relationships, but also that connection work of sharing food and coffee, and a word and a term that we don't often hear in other forms of work, which is taking the time to navigate the space and share the vulnerability. You know, I don't hear that coming out of BHP, maybe. Lula, so for you, how did you and the team tailor that Healthy and Wise project to make sure that it's a technical term, isn't it? You know, it's sort of almost defragged, that centering the lived experience was actually occurring. How did you do that?
The project came to us quite unexpectedly as an opportunity to work with DJCS. They sort of said, oh, we've got this grant and we'd like to work with WISE because we know you do this work pretty well. And when I saw it come through in my capacity as Manager of Gender Equity and Capability, which was, I have to say, one of my best jobs ever. I loved it so much. If anyone can ever work with WISE, please go and do that. You won't regret it. And when I was looking at the cohort of women that we were going to work with, I just knew that the power differentials were going to be overwhelming, and I didn't want it to be like we were coming in and preaching to people, right? So
Okay.
It was really important to me that we kind of level the playing field. And while we knew we were there to talk about domestic, family and sexual violence, and I personally have those experiences and happy to talk to those, I didn't, like, my experience is not these women's experiences. And I just kept coming at that thing. It's important to level the playing field. Like, I don't want them to feel like we're better than them. I don't want them, you know, I want to try and break down those barriers of disconnection, of power over, just thinking about even the location. You know, we were conscious that we would still be in a DJCS building, and what that would mean for those women coming into that environment. So I was like, look, I've got some lived experience, but I'm not going to be the leveler here. I don't have the direct connect. And even though I can work respectfully and I value these women and that they're going to come, I don't have the specificity of lived experience. So can we please bring in a lived experience, a specific lived experience facilitator to make sure that we're doing that as much as possible to demonstrate to these women that we value them and their experiences, and we're not there to talk down to them, but to really be there to work with them. So that was kind of the first thing that really struck me as much as possible. I was like, this isn't relevant to them unless we break down those barriers and consciously work through our place of privilege and power in that relationship setting. And one way I thought it was really important to do that was to bring in Nina. And I was just fortunate to know Nina. I was like, I know someone who can do this. So yeah, that those relationships. And when I think about why it worked, you know, there are some great frameworks out there. So the Experts by Experience framework, and if I just may speak to and reflect on those for a minute, like that I think, you know, we were doing this on the fly. It wasn't the ideal setup. I would have done so much more planning in ideation with Nina, and planning in you know, run sheets and design of each session if we had the chance. And that was a real test for us. And also that, you know, when working with lived experience, so much of it is you whether you're working with participants or working with lived experiences, we employ people. There are challenges in people's lives. It's not going to be your standard setup where everyone's going to turn up every week and they're going to be, doing it as a professional in those kind of ways that we would expect in other education settings or workplaces. So you have to really be flexible. But starting from the very beginning and looking back experts by experience, what we had was a genuine commitment. So we really wanted, from the top down, from Kit, from myself, from my amazing WISE co-facilitator, Zoe, we all really wanted to make sure that we centered lived experience and that we did what we had to do to bring lived experience and recognizing the value of that into the room with us and into this project the whole way. Transparency as much as possible. We tried to give Nina as much information up front about what she'd be doing, when she'd be doing it, what we wanted her there for. So it wasn't like you have to come in and actually talk about all these primary prevention concepts. It's like, no, we want you to be there to make those connections, to do the piece of relatability. There were times we were planning the room set up and Nina was like, oh, I wouldn't do it that way because putting the table there like that would make me feel really uncomfortable, or I would want this space between me and the other people. And all of those really amazing bits of insight that helped us. And just also, accepting that building trust with these women was going to take time. Like, we were really surprised by how much trust we developed in the short amount of time we had. We were like, look, these women never trust us. That's totally fine. We get it. We weren't there about our own egos, kind of going, oh no, they won't reject us. Don't they know that we're good people? We kind of had to chuckle that out the door and just be like, right, this is about them, not about us. So genuine commitment from the whole organisation. And look, we had a little bit of money, but I know we went above and beyond with our budget to make sure that we could do this as well as we could. Transparency, relationship building. So, Nina spoke on that so eloquently, and I don't think I have to unpack that, but relationship building is one of the key elements of doing the work well with lived experience. And that's, again, in the Experts by Experience framework. You can look to that. Compensation for participation. It was really important when we were doing the budgets that Nina was paid as much as any of the co-facilitators. We were all getting paid the same amount. And so it was critical from a valuing of her expertise, from that professionalisation angle, that we covered her remuneration fairly and equitably, and also that, as tricky as it was to do some of the logistical stuff, we didn't want her to be out of pocket for her travel and any costs that were sort of incurred as participating. And you have to be flexible sometimes in how you do payments and things, because people have, income restrictions, or they might be
don't have a tax file number. Yeah,
all of that sort of stuff. So you have to think about that in your planning as well. And providing support is one of the last key principles there. And we tried to do that as much as possible by, one, being on the level and being clear as we could and responsive to Nina's needs, but also making sure we did have that therapeutic backup in our facilitation team, that was on offer to the women in the group if they wanted to reach out outside of our sessions. And we also did debriefing with the facilitators after each session as well. And that was a group work, but also a mini survey just to sort of get that immediate feedback of what was the best thing for you in that, what worked, what didn't work, so that we were getting that feedback actively through it.
I've got to move on to the next speaker, but I just want to reflect back some of the key points that I've heard, if that's okay. I've heard you talk openly about acknowledging power, right? I've heard you talk about the level playing field and this sort of position shift in the planning to think about who you're working with and their environment and their location as well. I've also heard you talk about respect and trust. So the platform enabling this is about creating, again, we hear this word relationship and belonging, but also the walking of the talk, treating people equitably and respecting their skills as well. Is that sort of some of the things that you wanted to bring to the fore, the debriefing, the sharing, the professional approach?
Yeah, and I think that's really critical for the work that we do in-house when we're employing lived experience. But I think the respect and valuing lived experience speaks very much to the participants.
Yeah.
If you don't value and respect the people that you're working with in a really true way, they'll know that.
Yeah.
They'll pick up on that, and you're not going to have a good outcome. So for me, it was important that the team who was working with these women, we were all on the level ourselves, and we weren't coming in with bias and prejudice, or where we might have had those. We were unpacking that together and thinking about, where does that come from? Why would we think that? And choosing to really respect and value the wisdom and knowledge of the participant.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lula. I really appreciate that. And that line that you said, I think would resonate with our next speaker, who's Chantal Higgs. That line of, they'll pick that up, you know, if it doesn't resonate. So thanks so much, Lula. I might move on to our next speaker, which is Chantal Higgs. Chantal is the engagement lead at VMIAC on Bunurong lands, I can see, and is passionate about the systemic change and social justice. But she uses this passion and her own lived experience of mental health challenges for inclusion and accessibility to drive engagement of that lived experience across all events, activities, training and programs. I imagine, Chantal, that there's some things that you heard Lula and even Nina say that resonate with you as well. But I was wondering, because I guess we've invited you today because the lived experience work that you do is in what we call another sector, you know. But could you just tell us about the work that VMIAC does in relation to lived experience?
Yeah, look, before doing it, I just want to acknowledge, like you said, I'm on Bunurong lands, and acknowledge that any First Nation people here today, or people with lived experience of family violence or gender-based violence, I think that in particular, in relation to Aboriginal controlled organisations, you know, we're really building on the back of many things that they've done before us, both in legal services, health services, and responding to the issues that result from colonisation. So, like, I'm really lucky to be at VMIAC, and it's my first identified role of lived experience. I have led other teams. So I feel like I took, you know, a bit of a courageous leap to kind of name things that I've been living with previously. Here, we're working in the post-reform environment, following a royal commission into mental health that saw that people's human rights were being violated, and there was a real devaluing of lived experience in relation to, I guess, you know, mental health practitioners. And so it's really, like, I feel like there's other people we can learn from, but there's some really great things to consider in this space. And I wanted to really acknowledge the things I've heard just before, which is about the discomfort and power, you know, like they're the things that I feel like I can, you know, talk about here in the time we have available. But just before getting into that, I want to acknowledge something that I heard Lula say before, which is about, you know, the workforce. And I want to acknowledge that, you know, it's a predominantly, in my experience at least, like white middle-class workforce. And I think it's central we name these things, because it goes to the issue of power.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to offer up two principles that have been like central to me as a cis white able-bodied now middle class, because I certainly wasn't, you know, growing up, is positionality and reflexivity. So these are things that I feel like are really important to offer into this space as we look to address the systemic issues that are as a result of inequality. So positionality, for those who don't know, is about acknowledging and considering how our own personal values and location in time influences how we understand the world. And I think that's really important when we think about social change work. And reflexivity is about being able to respond and think about my own feelings and reactions to things that might come up. And I offer them up today because I think when you want to bring in and embed and support a lived experience workforce, there's going to be lots of discomfort for those in positions of privilege. And that goes through like one of my lovely topics about power. you know, and I
Yeah.
feel like we don't talk about that enough in community services. Maybe in the gender based environment that you're working in, you do, but in mental health, we haven't historically talked about how when we're invested in social change work, we're actually trying to change power structures, you know, about who has power to define what's normal or what's not. And ultimately, that's going to cause a lot of discomfort in our work. So I think when we talk about structural change, what I think lived experience is about, which is about addressing the structural imbalances and the favouring of particular like theoretical frameworks, we really need to talk about it. And that involves, like, for someone like myself, who, like I said before, is cis, white, able-bodied, heteronormative, thinking about difficult conversations, because they're going to come up. You know, when you want to look at oppression and people have experienced and are living with oppression, you need to be able to talk about that, because power will be moving. You know, that might be in a like a theoretical sense. So, you know, when I've seen that in the mental health space, it means like when you introduce lived experience, you're talking about a contest to the dominant theoretical framework. So whether it's psychiatry, psychology, and that's uncomfortable for people because it's an established way of doing things. And so, for example, when I have supported or been involved in the introduction of lived experience programs in mental health organisations, the leadership teams might be on board and committed.
Yeah.
It's not trickling down to a practitioner level, or a practitioner might be like on board, but like, what does this mean for me? So you need to be able to talk about how there's a disruption of the dominant ways of doing things and a redistribution of power, essentially. And I feel like others might talk about it later, about organisational change processes or implementation change processes. But in hindsight, that's stuff that I would love to have been, you know, more on top of when I was working in community services for young people and families, for example, you know. And I feel like another thing that's really common is there's this professional veneer that we have where people with lived experience don't have much patience for it, especially younger folk, which, you know, is a whole
Tell
other
me about that,
question.
Chantal. That sounds like another form of power control that you're talking about. You know,
yeah.
this kind of contesting space. Tell me about that.
Yeah, well, it is. It is really much a contesting space about dominant worldviews and how you go about social change. So, you know, in my experience working alongside, you know, young people of colour, including trans and young people of colour, they come in and they want things to change really quickly. And an older workforce can be like, no, you've got to be more pragmatic, like slow down. This is an incremental approach. And so you can get like quite a contested theory of change within an organisation. And you really need to be able to sit with that and allow that to be unpacked. So you need to be much more kind of like create space for those things. And prepare for it, because often, you know, an older generation, or I'll say it again, the white folk like myself are in established positions of power. And that means you have to be able to sit with the discomfort of the reality that people will be bringing to you and not be reactive to it, you know, not like, I'm part of that, but I can't be going, I'm going to get defensive. I'm not racist. You know, I'm here trying to do the good work. And I think Lula was talking about this before, which is in the help-seeking professions like this, we're all so committed to the social change that we're like, but that's not me. I'm not responsible for that, or I'm trying really hard. And sadly, that mentality can shut down the conversation. So it's really important that we're prepared and able to go in and sit with really challenging conversations and be able to hear what people have to say and take on board how they want to see things done, because it's not invested in the theoretical frameworks that we're so often
Wedded to.
deeply
Yeah.
wedded to.
Yeah, I might go. I'll move on to the next speaker, Nicole, in a second, but I just wanted to sort of try to reflect back what I've heard you say. You've talked about the need to sit with discomfort, and if we're doing this properly, we're actually questioning ourselves constantly if we're and recognizing that we're in those positions of power. I really like this idea of positionality, and I'm curious as to if one of the parts of that of the work for us is actually about developing the capacity of our sector to do that. But this idea of the contest, that lived experience centering is actually bringing the contest and the change work to set ways of thinking as well. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got to be prepared for that, is what I'm
Yeah.
saying. It's going to be uncomfortable, but there's ways that you can undertake that. Like, and you've got to think about the cultural safety of people that you might be bringing in alongside that, because there's the dominant folks.
Yeah, great.
But just prepare yourself is what I'm trying to say.
Thank
be
you.
on the ride. It's a beautiful ride, but it's not a comfortable one if you want to actually bring about change.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chantal. We've heard from you about the discomfort, the power, the contest, that it's a good ride, but not a comfortable ride. You know, we've heard from Lula about the transparency and the power as well about the level playing field. And from Nina, this emphasis on relationships as well. I might turn to you, Nicole Thompson. Everyone, Nicole is the acting CEO and manager of residential peer programs at an organisation called Shark, which is Self-Help Addiction Resource Centre. And everyone should know that Shark is the Australian hub for what's called International Peer Support Training, which WISE were introduced to about 18 months ago. And this training is a really, I think, powerful, to use that word again, a way of creating those transformative relationships. Nicole, not everyone on this line today will be familiar with the work of Shark. I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to just explain it. Would you mind, Nicole?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Nicole Thompson, or Nick. I prefer Nick. My pronouns are she and her, and I am calling in from Wurundjeri and Bunurong country today. I firstly just want to acknowledge the lived and living experience of people who experience family and sexual violence that are here today. So Shark, or the Self-Help Addiction Resource Centre, is a completely co-designed and co-produced consumer-led organisation that was created by people with a lived experience of alcohol and other drug-related harms. So all of the programs that we run are all essentially aimed towards our mission of improving the lives of people impacted by alcohol and other drug-related harms. And so that has led to all of our different program areas. So I'm the Deputy CEO and Manager of Residential Peer Programs. So we run residential programs for young people, adults, and then a specific program for people who identify as female, that are supported accommodation programs. So they're not residential rehabilitation, it's supported accommodation that's all based on peer support communities. And in my programs, I have a team of staff who are experienced clinicians who are all qualified clinicians, but also have a lived experience and use a lived experience lens in the way we provide our services. We also run Family Drug and Gambling Help, which operates a 24-hour helpline that is staffed by people with a lived experience of being family members and carers and loved ones of those impacted by alcohol and other drug-related harms and gambling harms. And most of the people in our organisation do identify as having a lived or living experience, whether as an individual who has experienced alcohol and drug-related harms themselves, or as a family carer or loved one. So we run a range of educational programs, programs for family members and carers and loved ones. Then we also run APSU, which is the Association of Participating Service Users, which is a consumer-driven program that is about advocacy and advocating for the voice of lived and living experience around their experiences of accessing services, around policy, around advocacy, around government reform. And we run a speaker bureau, so consumers participate in the speaker bureau, and then go and talk about their experience and are remunerated appropriately. We have set pay scales of what consumer participants who are doing that type of work should be paid, so that they're actually getting paid for sharing their expertise. And then we have a program called Peer Projects, which I think is the one that's most in alignment with what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Peer Projects is a program that was created really through Shark recognizing that as a lived experience organization, that is really our purpose is to elevate lived experience expertise and recognition of a lived and living experience workforce. That we identified that a lot of organizations were wanting to employ peer workers or lived and living experience workforce. And a lot of the feedback we were getting was quite negative experiences of people who were going into those roles, or that they weren't feeling supported. And we were getting feedback from organizations around concerns around employing peer workers or lived experience workforce and what that looks like and how they do that. So what happened from there was that we designed organizational readiness training. It was about us going, well, if organizations are going to do this, we want to make sure that lived experience workforce are supported appropriately.
What
But
does
also,
that? Yeah. Sorry, Nick. I'm quite excited about it. What does that what does organizational readiness look like for Shark?
so the organizational readiness training, and a lot of people initially, I just need to name, think that, oh, so that's for like the CEO and exec management. It's like, no, that's for all staff. So this is about bringing all of your staff in who are going to be either managing or supervising or working in the quality team or the risk management team, or, you know, as well as clinicians or colleagues working alongside peer workforce, to talk about what the lived experience and peer work lens is, what those roles look like, to ask the questions that maybe they have been scared to ask, or to demystify what that looks like and how you do that appropriately and safely, even to name some of the either implicit or explicit bias that can occur. I know that one of the things, a lot of the feedback that we get, and I can speak for myself as someone in a designated lived experience role.
Thank you, Nick.
I've worked in the community sector for 23 years, and I've only been in a designated lived experience role for the last 3 years. And a lot of that is around that safety to self-disclose, you know, that what's the bias that's going to occur? Am I going to experience a change in the way that people treat me, or the way that, you know, my expertise is seen, or the contributions I make? And that for a lot of people working in the sector, and we know throughout the community sector as a whole, and I don't have expertise in the primary prevention sector like all of you, and I just really need to name that. That's not my background. But the experience of a lot of people with lived experience in all sectors is that sense of, am I safe to self-disclose? What does that look like? So a lot of the organizational readiness training is about creating that safety. It's about demystifying. It's about naming the power that Chantel spoke about.
Yeah.
It's about providing a safe space for people to explore their own implicit or explicit bias, where they're not going to have any judgment whilst doing that, as well as then talking about what does this looks like from a systems approach. You know, the importance of, if you're going to employ somebody with a lived experience into a designated lived experience role, whether it's a lived or living experience role or a peer work role, the importance of actually being really clear about the PD and the role expectations. What is it you're wanting this person to do? What does that look like? So the people applying are completely informed. What does it then look like as far as, you know, the policies applicable? And a lot of organizations might come back to us saying, well, what do we do if this happens? And a lot of our conversations are, well, if we're being really clear about the person you're employing, the skills and attributes and experiences and expertise you're wanting them to bring, the duties and role you're wanting them to perform, what are the policies you have for the rest of the workforce? And what does, you know, because this is, I think sometimes there's, just to name it, there can be a bit of a view of less than, or not capable.
Yep, I've heard that. Yeah,
and it's really
deficit approach.
Naming all of that. But the other thing that we do is we provide, and we do it for the AOD sector, but I guess I can just share what we're doing and what we've been doing to support that workforce is we actually provide peer supervision. So something we see as really important that's been named is the support. So for us, role-specific supervision is essential. So
Okay.
working in a lived or living experience role and sharing your expertise and your lived experience, that you're getting supervision specific to what you're experiencing to support you. So
Yeah.
role-specific supervision, so supervision from somebody who also has a lived experience as a peer. So we supervise a lot of people that work in other organisations. So
Yeah, right.
they may do supervision with their direct supervisor organisationally around their role and operational requirements, but then they also, their organisation pays for them to do peer supervision with a peer supervisor at Shark, as well as that,
Okay.
to
Yeah.
support that role.
Yeah.
So we also run peer worker training that's about supporting peer workers around looking at what their role might entail, what that looks like for them, as has been talked about. If you're
Yeah.
sharing your lived experience and expertise, you know, we are humans. We are going to
Yeah.
there is going to be transference. There is going to be things that are really confronting. So how do we support that appropriately? How do we name that and talk about what might occur, but then really talk about strategies to support themselves when it does, but
Yeah.
have the resources and supports to access.
Yeah.
We also run a community of practice for peer workers across alcohol and other drug organisations in Victoria. So they've got a community of support and they meet regularly, as well as we have Basecamp, which is a web-based site that they all correspond through and talk to each other and share experiences, but also advertise roles and opportunities and professional development opportunities.
Nick, what you're describing is blowing my mind in terms of the infrastructure, the organisational structures, that idea of readiness, the preparation that goes in. Just taking a moment to work with the people as well, and I can see these incredible comments coming up as well through the chat. So thank you so much, everyone, for that. But you're talking about structures, the
Yes,
supervision,
systems,
the
policy.
training, and all of those sort of things that sit around it as well. Nick, I'm going to move on to our next speaker, if that's all right, but your generosity for all our speakers to communicate that in such a short time is so appreciated. So thank you so much, Nicole. I'm so grateful. We'll hear from you later, but I might move now on to Morgan Cataldo, who works as a senior manager of youth engagement at Berry Street, Victoria. Welcome, Morgan. And Morgan, I know you've dedicated your life to developing and advocating for what we call, or what we've known as, participatory practice and peer education for systemic change in what are often, sadly, excluded communities. And you're currently leading Why Change, which is this platform in Berry Street, which engages, trains and employs young people to harness their lived experience in socioeconomic disadvantage. I was just wondering if you can describe your work with Why Change and anything that's said before which resonates with you and what you do. Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kit. So I work 1 day a week at Berry Street with Why Change. So I was working there as the senior manager, but I'm now a senior advisor. So
Right.
I do lots of different things all around the place.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things that I'm most
Okay.
passionate about, is trying to figure out how we integrate that lived experience practice for the sort of up and coming generations of lived experience consultants that are coming.
Yeah.
There's so much that's already been said, so I just want to sort of echo what everyone's already said.
Okay.
But there's sort of 3 things that I was just taking some notes as people were talking, because it felt particularly resonant with me. And then maybe, so I'll just read those out and then I'll talk a little bit about Why Change.
I'd love that. Thank you.
So with the first is about, I think we've all talked about power structures, which I think are really important. And something that's been really important for me, coming as someone who was a peer worker and then sort of a peer consultant and then moving into policy and advocacy and then systems change, was that one of the really important things I think we all have to grapple with is that as people with lived experience, we have been disempowered in some contexts, but then when we come in as a lived experience expert, we actually start to have power over others. And so it's this kind of interesting grapple. So I think Chantal really talked to this beautifully about when you come into a space as particularly a white person, all of a sudden you have power over potentially other people. And so something I work quite deeply and a lot on with people is that you might have sites of oppression in your identity somewhere, but then in other parts and in other contexts, you might actually have power over others. And that's something I think we need to grapple with quite a lot, because I think it's quite easy to identify, or sometimes really identify, with the parts of ourselves that are oppressed, but actually pay less attention to the parts of ourselves that might be in domination to other people, and actually what that will mean for decentering ourselves and actually needing to create space for others. We've talked a lot about sort of where this work comes from, and I think the thing I often nerd out about and get very excited about is actually the deep theory that's behind this work. So I think that we think that with lived experience, there's no theory to it, and sort of lived experience experientially, no, there's not, because it comes from experience of our lives, right? But also like where it comes from, how we center it, and lived experience as a way of knowing, being, and doing is deeply theoretical. And the majority of people that have written on this topic are Black women, which I think is something to be really, really present to. And so something I often think about and talk about is how do we dive really deep into the activism historically that's been written about this work, because I think that's really, really important. So Patricia Hill Collins is someone who I like to refer people to, who talks really deeply about sort of that phenomenological ways of understanding knowledge. And she talks a lot about something called connected knowers for people who have lived experience. So I often come to the work thinking to myself, you know, lived experience is not the truth, it's a truth. And for each of us, it's a truth, you know, because my lived experience of family violence or my lived experience of homelessness is a experience, not the experience of the issue. And so how do we sort of work alongside others to understand that what we are trying to do is have lived experience valued as a form of knowledge alongside all others as equal, not greater than. And that's something I'm extremely passionate about, because I think we have to watch for dynamics of domination, even in centering lived experience. And then the last thing I think that, you know, Chantal again talked really beautifully about is we really need to get present to who dominates this practice. So the majority is white women, including myself. And so we need to be really careful about the lenses through which this work gets explored. And if we think about ways of knowing, being, and doing, and how we make sense of concepts, you know, who gets to make sense of the concepts and talk about them and language them and create terms for them.
Yep.
And that's something that I'm often really present to. So how do we sort of actively create space to step back and allow other people to step forward and help create new knowledge, where sometimes the new knowledge that's coming is from a dominant group of people who are all saying similar things. So that's the three things I've written down, because I was so
Oh my, I'm blown
away
away again. I don't know if you can hear, I'm madly typing down, you know, what you're saying.
Yeah.
I need to ask you about the why, but
yeah.
I'm wondering if I can ask you to describe how the why then makes sure that it steps back to make space for new knowledge.
Yeah. So I think, you know, I'll talk a bit probably just from my perspective, because that's what I can talk through. But when I started this work, what was really important, that actually there were parts of me that I had to center at the time.
Okay.
Because they were parts of my lived experience that had been neglected, ostracized, erased from my personality, because in a dominant system, I was excluded because of them, you know, my experiences of family violence, homelessness, mental illness, etc., etc. And then what happened as I continued working, what became really challenging was all of a sudden I'd worked really hard to center those parts of myself, and then realized that those experiences were still from the frame of me, who is someone from a dominant group of people. So actually I then had to work to decenter myself, which was very painful in some ways, because when you work really hard to center those parts of yourself that have been ostracized and erased, it can be very painful and very upsetting when you start to think, there's actually a lot of spaces where that's not such an important experience, because other people's experiences are more marginalized and they need more attention and they need to come more into the center. So I guess the why behind that was, you know, when I was moving through service systems when I was very young, was two things. The first thing I kept thinking was, why aren't we partnering with people with lived experience? Because there's so much wisdom in these communities, and we need to sort of center and privilege it. But the second thing I started to see was, why is it that I'm getting treated a certain way in systems and other people are getting treated a certain way in systems, and others are being treated completely differently? And that, obviously, I was very young, so I didn't have the language at the time or the concepts to understand that. But as I got older, I understood it was all around positionality and position, but also identity and, you know, things like structural racism and who was getting treated in certain ways because of who they were, which then opened the door for me to understand more about my own responsibility in my position of, yes, my lived experience is really important, but it's not the experience, it's a experience. So I think that's where a lot of the why came from, was just a lot of what I was observing, and a lot of, I've got very close connections with people in community that I've traveled with over time through systems, and it was through listening and talking with them about their experiences as well, and going, where's the disconnect here? Why is your experience so different to mine? Not that mine was great, but theirs was even worse. Yeah, so that's a bit of the why there.
Amazing. Well, I'm completely blown away. I mean, what I've heard in this, you know, Morgan, that you've shared is this idea about the reframing, the constant reframing. I think, you know, I think Chantel, you talked about reflexivity and positionality, and I think that certainly, I can see Chantel nodding. And, you know, Nina, you talked about, you know, we started this talk about relationships, and I guess without relationships that are trusting and transparent, as Lula said, that's core to this constant centering and decentering as well. We've talked about power, we've talked about the level playing field, that the time that's involved. You know, we've heard from Nick too about those organizational structures that sit around this. We are now, everyone, going to take 5. I certainly needed to kind of pull the neurons back into line a bit. So after this break, we're going to come back, and Danny, if you're there, we're going to put people into breakout rooms, aren't we? And those breakout rooms are going to facilitate a conversation. So I'm going to thank those incredible speakers for sharing and bringing their wisdom and their experience to this conversation. We'll hear from them later, but can everyone please take a 5-minute break, stretch your legs, grab a drink if you want to. If you've got a question, put in the back in the chat, and we'll come back and we'll have that discussion and breakout groups. And if you haven't yet, can you please fill in the survey, and Danny or Yihan might put that in the chat. So switch off your cameras and your sound if you want to, or leave it on. We can hear the kettle boiling, but we'll see you in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. We've got people coming back. I'm hoping people got a chance to get a cup of tea or rush to the facilities or the bathroom or get a drink of water. Take your time, folks, when you're ready. Good to see everyone's faces. Just while people are coming back, if you wouldn't mind either sticking your thumbs up on your screen to say you're back, or putting your camera on and off or something like that, so we can just see if folk are back. Thanks so much, folks. That's amazing, because I can see it when it comes up on the screen. You see, it's great. Folks, what we're going to do now is have a bit of a plenary discussion, as it were, and I'm going to talk, if I can, to the panelists. I've got Chantel and Nicole, Lula, and hopefully Morgan. I can see Danny doing the Zoom facilitator look, which is where you do the look across the screen to find the button. So hopefully Morgan will be looped in. There she is. We're about to send people into breakout rooms, and we're clearly having this panel discussion to try to, I guess, synthesize and process all that incredible information and knowledge. And Nina, if Nina's here, I'd love Nina to join us as well. But I guess what I'd like to do is, Lula, I might turn to you first, if that's okay. You know, we heard about power, we heard about the naming of the approach, the kind of the demystifying. We've heard organisational readiness, we've heard reflexivity, positioning, we've heard the structures that need to be put around it, relationship. When you feel all of that, what are the things of success that need to come together, I think, if we do lived experience in a primary prevention setting to the best that you think?
So you're asking me what
would
needs
you
to be
do
in place for success for primary prevention?
Yeah, what would you do?
That's all.
Yeah.
That's what you're asking. Okay.
Yeah.
I think the very first step is recognizing that the space of primary prevention is a pretty privileged one. It can be quite academic and quite the language used, the focus on frameworks and policy can be quite inaccessible to your average person. Like if you say primary prevention, I mean, even that language, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So I think the first step is a bit of
like that
reflection about I love primary prevention, and I don't want this to come across as a criticism of my colleagues at all, but it's a bit of an ivory tower.
Yeah.
It's a bit removed.
Yeah. Who even understands that term, frankly, really? Yeah.
So I think a bit of reflection on where it sits. And the work is so important, but a lot of it is it's very frontal lobe kind of thinking stuff. It's kind of not an embodied thing a lot of the time. So I think really bringing that sense of reality to it as much as possible is going to be, I think that's what lived experience does for primary prevention, because you can have all of the shoulds and the ideas of where it needs to operate, in what spaces, but this is the how. So I think it's the how that we reach the audiences, and how do we engage with people. It's that leveling thing, it's not us coming and going, this is what you should be doing. If you don't, you're bad people, and you're not as, it's
we do that, don't we? It's the virtue finger pointy thing.
Yeah. And look, it's important. It is political, but it shouldn't be about judgment of others.
Okay.
All right. So I think if that's where we can start to make it work, is a reduction of judging those that we're seeking to work with to create change. I think that would be really critical. And I think that does bring about that valuing of lived experience. You know, there has to be some radical acceptance of people where they are, where they're at, and acceptance that things are messy and aren't going to go to this predetermined plan of I have this program and it's going to go this way and this is what we're going to do and it's all going to be fantastic. So I think starting how do we successfully embed lived experience in primary prevention is making it real and yeah, bringing in language, bringing in real life scenarios, knowing that it's going to be hard and dropping our sense of judgment that what we do is righteous and people who don't get it yet are less than somehow.
Oh my
I think
gosh,
that's
look at
just
those nods.
replicating systems of power and privilege that are unhelpful.
Yeah. Hey, I'm going to go to Nicole because you used the shiny heart before when Lula said it shouldn't be about judgment. When you, from an organisational standpoint, what are the things that Shark sees that perpetuate judgment? What are the things that organisations do that stop them from, is this a word? I don't know, de-judging?
Oh, so my answer is going to be based on our experience in the alcohol and other drug sector.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah.
So we might get organisations, you know, saying we want to employ living experience workforce and peer workers, but what do we do if they show up to work substance affected? You know, like that. So their reluctance will be on it's a risk. You know, there's this focus on risk all the time, which is a really kind of challenging one. But if that non-judgment thing is about going, if that's what they're thinking, we need to provide a space to have the conversations.
Okay.
To name that that's their concern, that's what's stopping them or impacting them actually engaging with lived experience workforce. And, you know, and a lot of our responses are going, well, if you've been really clear in the PD about the role and who you're wanting to employ, what you're wanting them to do, how would you respond to other staff in the workforce? You'd be offering support, you'd be naming it, you'd be providing those avenues for support. So it's, what I would say is for us, a lot of what breaks down a lot of those barriers is things like organisational readiness, or whatever way you want to do that, where you provide the space to have the non-judgmental conversations where people can raise their concerns. They can ask the questions that they're probably not wanting to voice out loud for fear of recrimination about it. And having those conversations with lived experience workforce professionals that can engage in the conversation in a way where we're actually just trying to go, how do we get the best outcomes for lived experience workforce staff and then the people that we're supporting? So it's that really, I think that non-judgment thing is sometimes it's allowing those conversations and not judging any implicit bias or concerns people might have, but naming what they are, working through them, finding solutions. From the organisational readiness perspective, working with other organisations, that's been what's been the most useful space.
Nina, I might ask you to respond to this next question, because I know part of the work that lived experience advocates do in family violence is, if I can put it this way, bear the burden of helping organisations and workers go through this process, if I can say that. So my experience of lived experience advocates is often they're brought in to fix the system that's perpetrating the abuse against them. What care of self do we need to be thinking of when we work with lived experience workers, that they're not asked to constantly, or they're not put in a place to fix things? What things do you look out for, you know, in that work, Nina? Could I ask you to speak to that? Do you mind?
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept, isn't it? I know too, as an abolitionist, like, you know, I'm time and time again expected to know all of the solutions. So it's been context to that sort of thing that, like, you know, if there's a barrier that you have identified as a lived experience person, then immediately you should know the solution. And it's like, oh, I'm just identifying the barriers. And I think as a community, we develop the solutions. And I think in saying that too, that, like, you know, I'm a firm believer that, like, this mandatory sort of approach to all individual issues is where we've really come and hit sort of the main barriers. Because, you know, when I think about community development and having those answers and coming together and forming these solutions, what might work in my community, even though the structures are similar, may not work in another community. So I think it's really important to be able to navigate those solutions as a collective and as a community. And I just want to go back to on that, you know, I think there's this real paradigm of like risk versus vulnerability. And I think that, you know, if I'm always, you know, because I've got criminalisation and drug use and all sorts of intersectionals that are very heavily stigmatised against, and I've always been deemed as a risk. So I think when I'm deemed as a risk, then I have that finger pointing approach where I then experience a lot of stigma and discrimination and judgment, and that in turn prevents me from being vulnerable. And, you know, I step back further and further into my shell and move further and further away into the shadows, and then I'm not able to openly share. So I think that, like, you know, if we think about the risks and really elevate people to be able to share vulnerably, then we'll be able to have a whole lot more of a holistic approach to finding solutions.
Thank you, Nina. Morgan, I'll go to you and then I'll go to you, Chantel, but I saw, Morgan, you doing preach, you know. Can I ask you what was resonating for you when you heard your colleagues talk? What was that sharing? I can see your hand up too, Lula. So I'll go
Did
there.
you want to go to Lula? Because I think Lula's had their hand up.
Yeah, oh, sure. Thanks, Morgan. Lula.
I always want to hear from you, Morgan, so I don't want to take much airtime. But for me, what was coming through when Nina was speaking with, and some of the reflections we've had earlier is, yes, a lot of us do this work. A lot of us do this work because we've got lived experience, for one, and that needs to be recognised across the workforce in a way. I think that Nicole or perhaps Chantel was talking about creating the space to disclose that, and to be, well, what happens for me if I disclose that I have lived experience of the area that I'm really passionate about? Seems crazy, but hey, that's where we need to start. But really, for the people who are, you know, we're doing that academic thinking work, that structural change work, that how do we do systems piece, which, as I said, can be a bit academic, but is really critical. Even though we've come to do good work, I think we have to interrogate, but am I part of the problem, or how am I part of this problem?
Yeah.
How am I part of the systems that replicate this? And we can't ever completely detach, I think, from the system, but we can be much more self-aware and much more real with ourselves about where we participate in it. And I think that's a really hard question for people to sit with when we're motivated to try and do good. When we have a social justice compulsion and we want to see change happen, sometimes it's the most difficult question to think of ourselves, but how am I contributing to this? And it's even thinking that I'm a good person because I do this work. That might be a problem in and of itself.
Yeah. Morgan, forgive me, because I want to just, if I can just jump to Chantel. Chantel, is this what you're talking about when you talked about positioning and reflexivity?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I feel like sometimes we don't have tools to name or like sit with those things. And I just want to say, like, when I see Morgan putting their hands up, you know, I seen that what intention folks like can get particularly fragile about the difficult conversations for the things that we were saying. But like, you know, I'm really good. It's not my responsibility. That's come before me. Like, I'm part of the change. But they're, you know, also really invested in maintaining the power and privilege they have, because, you know, there is a hierarchy within the community services, right? Like we don't want to talk about it, but people with certain degrees are paid more. They're seen as hard science. It's a better science than soft science, and right fragility, as someone's saying, 100%, is part of that. But if I come back to kind of the stuff that I feel like Nina was talking about before in the mental health space, but also when I worked in youth services, where we're introducing like people of color or queer and trans people of color, we had a 2-up policy. You didn't just have one person with lived experience, you needed a minimum of 2, because despite your best efforts, there's still a minority within a dominant culture, and it wasn't about just your practice leads, it was about your corporate services, it was about your HR, like you're talking about serious structural change. And because I'm an abolitionist like Nina, if I can say, women are, and particularly family violence, often criminalized if you're a person of color, right? So you need to look at your policies. And same with people of color, right? So they may have criminal histories. So you can't have a blanket rule that anyone with a criminal history can't be hired. You need to interrogate that and look at how you still uphold your commitment to child safety. And Nicola, sorry, I should say people with AOD, histories of use, fundamentally in that category as well. You need to look at all of those processes and systems to bring about change. And I put a link a little bit up earlier, going to the 2-up point. And I've definitely seen this. Like we bring people in, and there's a whole phenomena like that's documented around, say, women of color. You bring a woman of color in, and everyone's like, "Yeah, we've got to change it," and everyone rallies around. And then they become solely responsible for pointing out like institutional systemic racism. But after a while, they become marginalized because they're consistently naming these things and they become the problem.
Yeah.
So, you've really got to think about like how you build allyship and how you dismantle like those patterns of like rendering invisible the structural disadvantage. It takes, I think you talked about it when we caught up, Kit, like how do you maintain the commitment to it? Like you're going to bring about this work. It's a long process, and you don't want to slip back to old ways of doing things, which is why I talk about power, because it wants to hang on. I'll say in the mental health reform space, we talk about commitment to lived experience, but does the system change?
Yeah.
Or do we go back? And I think about First Nations folks, and they talk about Royal Commissions. Do they deliver change? I'd say to some degree, but it's outside institutions where the real work happens, which is why primary prevention and other spaces are instrumental to like real deep structural change. So I feel like someone else was going to speak. Was I supposed to throw you here, Morgan?
No, that's fine. And Chantel, I might just move to Morgan and then we'll go into the breakout rooms. But Morgan, Chantel did this. She said, we're really serious about lived experience, but what is this for you? Because I think we need to make that a technical term. Because I get that, right? But what's this for you? Like when you see it, what's that space that stops that makes the slip back happen?
Well, this is in systems theory, and I'm a nerd, everybody. And the other thing I think is real fun is a lot of this stuff is stuck in theory and we haven't translated it into practice to make us make sense of it. So that's part of what I get really obsessed about.
Yeah.
But this is a phenomenon called the system snapback. So I'll share an article after I talk. But this is something where
Thank you,
where there's kind of a dominant system and then there's an emerging system of practice. So you can see lived experience as the emerging system of practice that's challenging the dominant way of doing things. Now, there's lots of different people in that dominant system. You've got kind of like your early adopters who are like, oh, hell yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Let's go. Then you've got the late adopters who are like, you haven't quite convinced me. And then you've got people that are just straight up like, I'll never agree with what you think. Okay. So that's just what happens. But the thing with system snapback and that is like, I think a lot of what happens is, and this is what at least what I hear and experience a lot is people saying, oh, no question that lived experience is important and then we have to do it, but maybe not like that. maybe not with those people. So there's all these kind of qualifiers around how and why to do lived experience and who gets to speak on behalf of, and et cetera, et cetera. And there was something someone said before, just so many things, which is why I keep putting my hands up. But I think something that's really helped me to define something today is what a lot of people are saying, and I try to say, but probably in really bad ways, is like, I feel like people with a lived experience are often seen as the scapegoats of the dominant system. Oh, everything's failing. Let's get the buffers of that system who seem to be our ethical and moral compasses to fix it all. And like what Nina said, you'll have the solution, right? The amount of times I'm in rooms and it's like, oh, Morgan's got the lived experience. What do you think? Do you have the solution? I'm like, this is just absolutely and utterly wild. So I think what it is, it's like, it was like before when I said we're not the truth, it's our truth. It's not the lived experience, it's our lived experience.
Yeah.
I think what it is about is saying, I myself am not the solution. Me in this body, in this mind, I am not the solution. I am someone with a worldview and a lens that can help to facilitate the conditions where different solutions may emerge and new knowledge can be created. But I can only do that with other people. I can't do that. It's not just me as the funnel of that myself. And that's what I wish we'd understand more around lived experience work. And I think that it'd help us get out of that kind of obsession with representation. You know, if I have one First Nations person and one person with a lived experience and one person with mental illness or one person who's being criminalized or incarcerated, and all of a sudden you're meant to speak on behalf of thousands and thousands of people, whereas your experience is one experience that can help to unlock something in a space or a room and a conversation for more worldviews to come into the space. So yeah, that's what I've been thinking over.
Yeah. Brilliant. We've got to go to breakout rooms, but Laura, I can see you've got your hand up. So just before we do that, did you have a comment to add to that before I've got to do this awful thing and wrap this up and move us into the next stage?
Yeah, I just think what Morgan is saying is so important for we sort of do the reverse idealization of particular individuals who are then meant to speak on behalf of everyone. And that has happened quite a bit in the victim survivor advocate space, where they're like, oh, I've got this one person and aren't they amazing and aren't they great? And it's a lot of pressure to put on someone, but it also silences a whole bunch of other people. And we just replicate this kind of hero mentality in worship when we don't need a hero, we need the systems to change. And that takes everyone to do it. And it's just another way of positioning the problem as external to yourself. You know, it's like, oh, this person can do it, that person can fix it. And it's like, no, we all have a role to play. What's my bit in it?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so grateful, indebted, and I'm so sorry I've got to bring this to a close. But right now, I know from the chat that's going on in the chat that people's heads are buzzing. So
Welcome back. How did you all go? Nat, could you type fast enough?
Only just. It's like
not enough time.
I know.
And can I just say the Zoom breakout closure is brutal.
Yep.
Mind you, I have been in training rooms once where I wish, in live sessions where I wish I had that button. Going to bring you all back in now, folks. How are we? How are we? Gosh, it's nearly end of time and I'm kind of a bit blown away. Look, the fact and the brutal truth, another brutal truth, folks, is we don't have time to actually go through everything. So, yeah, we really needed more time. That's right, Chrissy. But the good news is that I said at the start, this is the start of a process. Mm-hmm. So it's not the only conversation. And I think if anything we've learned today, that's vital. I want to connect back, if I can, with our amazing presenters, I think, who, for me, have inspired my sense of understanding and brought with them the language and the constructs. And I'm really interested and invite everyone to make comments in the chat, please, if they want to. In those conversations that you were a part of, what were you noticing? What were you noticing? I was in the room with you, Nina. I might start with you. What came through for you in those conversations?
Definitely the power imbalances and the power dynamics.
Yeah.
And also I think what we spoke about a lot was like these really rigid practices of creating frameworks and guidelines and having unrealistic deadlines and everyone being at capacity and like, you know, scrambling to complete something and not giving it actually the time and the space that it needs.
Yeah,
Authentic.
interesting. Yeah, and I think there was a recognition in our group about what I found really interesting is in our group is that sort of people when people automatically went, this needs to be for leaders, people in power, doesn't it? That was interesting. Any others? I think Morgan, you were in a group that I know you would have had a great conversation there too. What resonated for you? Like, who did people say this needs to be for? This work needs to be for when you were in your conversation?
Well, all of us.
Yeah.
And I
That
think the
came
thing that really resonated with me was something that Stephen said, and we were talking about. I think what happens a lot with this work is we create best practice or good practice, but we are so far away from that in a lot of different contexts. And so people get very overwhelmed by going, I've read the framework, I've looked at the thing, we are nowhere even near touching that. So something we were talking about was how do we create maybe principles that are almost like principles for where we're at now versus ambitious and aspirational principles for where we'd like to get to. And so one of the things Stephen was saying that I just loved was like, just in and of itself, the honesty of we know we're not getting this right now, but we are on the journey of learning to get it right. And we'll continue to be challenged by inviting different and more diverse perspectives into the space that continue to challenge us. And as we continue to be challenged, the process will continue to change and we will be able to reach those aspirational principles. So I just really love that framing. There's just something about that I think is gorgeous about how do we actually lean more into the vulnerability and the honesty of not getting it right versus what seems to happen in the sector all the time is we're getting it perfect. We're so good. Hey, look at us over here. We're the like leaders of this. And then you go in and you go, oh my God, this is the opposite of good practice. So I think it's actually more radical to say, we know what this is not great practice, but we're on the journey of good practice. And I think some of the best practice that I experience is in those spaces where people are just being honest, actually, because it's a safer, much safer place to be able to do the work.
Is this also about, Morgan, before I go, and I'll go to Lilia next, because there was this word that you used a few times in the opening plenary, which was about allowing yourself, I think actually Nina, you said it, of giving you the space to be vulnerable. Are we actually talking about a process or a framework that is consciously, constantly vulnerable?
Yes, but also being, I think, just a bit of a thing about vulnerability is really defining what we mean by vulnerability, right? Because for people with lived experience, when you're in a culture that says we invite and welcome vulnerability, like we've got to be really careful about that, because there's a lot of people I support through supervision who are being managed out of organizations for their vulnerability, right? So I think it's what we mean by vulnerability in this context is that we are being open about not being perfect about a process, not necessarily that I come into a space and as a person with lived experience sharing vulnerably means that I'm quote unquote oversharing, upsetting people, etc., etc. So I think we just have to be really clear about vulnerability of process, not necessarily vulnerability of lived experience, because for a lot of people, they don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be vulnerable anymore. I don't have the energy for it. So it's vulnerability of process. Yeah.
I'm just writing down everything that you said, Morgan. Lula. Thank you, Morgan. Lula.
So good, Morgan. Yeah, so much people sort of want the trauma porn version of it and then don't like what they hear, and you get rejected for expressing the thing that they came to you for to ask. So vulnerability of process is critical. And I, working in this, you engage with clients who are like, oh, we want to work with lived experience, blah, blah. I'm like, great, let's go through and we'll do some, self-reflection, we'll do where you're at. And even the practitioners I work with who are doing this, some of them are like, oh, they don't have this yet, and they don't have that yet. Oh, they're so far away from best practice. I'm like, yeah, because if they were doing best practice, we wouldn't be here working with them. So like, this is a learning process. People are not perfect. This idea of perfection, let's take perfection off the table. One, no, like there's best practice. Let's recognize that that's aspirational and we're dealing with the real of business. Two, we are, the language of meeting people where they're at is like, you know, overused, but for people who are doing this work, there's a lot of moral shoulding and values shoulding. And I think we need to go, well, these people have put their hands up to say, we want to learn. Let's respect that and try to work with that. And it's not going to be ideal. It's not going to be, you know, first go, we're going to make mistakes, but we've got to learn from those mistakes. That's okay. Like it's going to be messy. So that vulnerability of process, I think, is the perfect phrase. Let's get some badges. Coin that phrase, accredit it to Morgan Lee Cataldo. We need that on t-shirts. Love it. So I'll back off now.
That's good. While we're finishing off today, I might get Danny to share the post-chat survey in the chat, just that while we're doing that. You know, Chantel and Nicole, you know, if there's any observations, you know, you've come to this conversation from, I think, industries that at least I look at as, well, you know, you've got the lived experience thing, but I'm sure you're going to go, you know, but is there any other observations that you'd make about the conversations that you bore witness to? Anything that resonated that you just want to highlight in this moment? Nicole, I might go to you first and then Chantel.
I will try and be really quick because I can talk underwater. What I've noticed through the entire forum and in the conversation I was in was that it does seem like there is a lot of excitement and that people are really wanting to embrace this. Yeah. You know, it's not like there's a reluctance, there's not a negativity towards it, there's not fear towards it, which is a really exciting opportunity. I guess the main thing I would say, just to think, and the conversations we had, was really within the principles, like none of us know everything. You know, like what's been stated, like I'm only the expert in my own experience. You know, that's where my expertise is. But also just thinking about how do we truly create safe spaces for people to disclose lived experience.
Yeah.
You know, like you're going to have, I'm assuming, and this is an assumption, but you're going to have a workforce where you probably have a lot of people with a lived experience currently. How do you create safe spaces for people to disclose that? How do you value it, but then provide the appropriate supports to them in that, like, it is really vulnerable to disclose that. It's not about them having to disclose every aspect, but just the disclosing it itself. It can create a vulnerability there. So how do you make it safe? How do you provide the supports?
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. And Chantel, I'll go to you now.
Yeah, well, I think there's so much wisdom here today. So it's like such a pleasure and privilege to be hearing from people, including the people in the breakout room. You know, I think there was a willingness to sort of be curious about how maybe it's lived experience is occurring in their workplace already, but maybe my take on it is that maybe it's not being valued the way it could or should be. And so people are wanting to maybe explore how to strengthen that and support, reinforce its value. And then I guess one of the big things that I heard, that I think I've heard like in the breakout, but here is about that it's a whole organizational approach. You know, there's the aspects about supporting people, like around the things that say Morgan and Lula and Nikki are saying about the vulnerability and knowing that it's already actually there. And how do you provide the opportunity for people to name that, and the supports about what does it mean to use the lived experience and what's the shared understanding about your principles for doing that. That's certainly something I feel like FIMIAC's been grappling with as someone, like as an organization that's gone from like, you know, like I don't know, probably like 5 people in part-time roles and seriously underfunded to like 30 plus. What's a shared understanding of how you actually implement lived experience? And then we also talked about the necessity of not just sitting with the status quo around recruitment, you know, getting outside the existing people that you're engaging with, and making sure that you don't just recruit from the more privileged aspects of the community. So changing things in such a holistic way.
I'm about to hand over to Danny, but Lula, I can see your hands up maybe. I know that there's something that's resonating with you there.
That point of recruitment actually is what I wanted to talk about. Like you have to push yourself beyond your comfort, and relationships are really important, but we need to find ways to build relationships with communities and with people who don't often get these opportunities. And I think even just looking at who's here today, I mean, we're all coming from pretty privileged spaces. There's no brown, black faces here. There's no migrant people on this panel. So I think the opportunity to push ourselves to do that, it requires dedication. It also requires longer lead times, longer times to make relationships, to build trust. And it also requires a bit of personal rejection when you're like, oh, okay, they don't want to play with us because their previous experiences have been really bad. Okay. So again, that reflexive piece, but building the time in and the flexibility in to these processes is really important, and we just practice that and push ourselves to kind of work through some of those tricky dynamics, especially around recruitment.
Yeah, thank you for that honesty and that transparency. I appreciate that, Lula. Thank you, everyone. I am now going to hand back to the creator of this moment, which is Danny McCaffrey, who's going to do some thanks. But on behalf of WISE, I want to thank Morgan, Chantel, Nick, Nina and Lula for your generosity and your wisdom here today and being part of this moment. Look forward to being able to engage and work with you as we move forward. But what I'll do now is I'll ask Danny to take us all off spotlight, as it were, and I'll hand back over to her. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I don't know how to do the the spotlight thing for everybody, but I just wanted to thank everybody for coming along today. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the panelists. I think it was an amazing discussion, but it feels like the beginning of something. If everybody can fill out the survey, that would be fantastic. And I'll send around the recording and the survey as well later on today or tomorrow. And I also wanted to shout out to all of the WISE staff who scribed for the breakout rooms today. Thank you so much. Couldn't have done it without you, and really appreciate everybody's contribution to this. So thank you. Bang on 12. Well done, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Looking forward to
Be in touch
continuing the
soon.
discussion. Stay tuned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.